Good morning, coronavirus sexes. This is the Ticker Guy. And here we are with your weekend update for Saturday. Don't know if we'll do one for Sunday. And there may be some interruption here in the next couple of weeks. Frankly, not sure that continuing to repeat that which has become obvious is gaining all that much. And secondly, at some point the people just have to decide whether they're going to put up or shut up, I guess. Yeah, the scolding Karens who are trying to throw cold water on the Stanford study are rather amusing. If you remember, they attempted to keep that quiet until they got their stuff written up and ready for submission to a journal. Hasn't been peer-reviewed yet, but it will be. And one can see why when the evidence is that we have understated the rate of infection with our positive tests by somewhere between 50 and 85. Now, to put some perspective on this, at the lower end, the lower boundary of that, New York has already reached suppression, not extinction from herd immunity, but suppression. At the upper boundary, it's over. And we're not there on an extrapolated basis because it's not over. There's still people getting infected. But the interesting thing about this is that there are people who are saying, oh, well, that's just one little community out in California and it doesn't really apply and da-da-da-da-da. Careful with that, folks. As I have pointed out for a very long time, the epidemiological models, the ones that actually are worth something, by the way, all sort of make the assumption that a nation or a globe or a whatever is a homogeneous population. This, of course, is a bunch of BS because that's not how it works. You have your social circle, but it's leaky. So your social circle is a micro colony, if you will, and then some of the members within your social circle leak whatever it is that one of you might have and pass around to another one, and so on and so on. In large metro areas, it behaves quite homogeneously because you have mass transit, and someone within your circle is a part of that, and so is someone from most everybody else's. And so with very few exceptions, those larger areas, those larger metros, have that kind of behavior. Now, in places where you don't have large mass transit systems, even though it's a city, is not necessarily true. But in places where you do, it tends to behave that way. And so your large cities like D.C., New York, Chicago, all have that kind of a thing to them. But dig this. Chelsea, city manager, ran this pilot study and says, oh, wow, we grabbed a random sample of 200 people, too small, by the way, for statistical significance, and ran antibody tests and found a 30% seropositive rate and said that this was a disaster. It's not a disaster. It's actually says that all of the BS that you've been doing with lockdowns has done nothing. It's just absolutely done nothing. And so here we go. When you get down to it, what it means is that you're one turn, literally one viral generation away from achieving that 66% that suppresses the virus below 1.0 transmission. And by the way, your generation time on this virus is about 5 or 6 days. So you were a week or less away from having, when this was done. All right, and when were these tests pulled and when were the results reported? Well, by now, okay? Now, hospitalization, death all lag behind that because it takes time for you to develop symptoms. It takes time for you to get sick enough to show up at the hospital. It takes time, of course, for you to die. And so those numbers are going to lag. But the seropositive rate is not conjecture, folks. It's fact. And it tells you basically what the story is there. Now, here's the other thing that's interesting is the Pine Street Inn homeless shelter, Boston South End, had a small cluster of cases, and they swabbed everybody. So this is active virus. Now, they found 146 positive tests, but nobody with symptoms. Now, think about that one. Okay, so, we've all been, we've had, Fauci, is it Mr. Hoax and Ms. Hoax, Ms. Birxie Hoax. says again, oh well, there's maybe 20 or 30% of people that are positive but don't have symptoms. Bull spat. Okay, this was from these people at the homeless shelter. Not one of them had symptoms. None. And guess what? They didn't serotest the rest of those folks, or any of them for that matter. So, absolutely nothing. Absolutely nothing. And wait a minute. What does this tell you about the ability to suppress the infection? Because if you're walking around with no symptoms, you don't know you have it, then short of putting everybody in a single isolation room with isolated air and water and food supplies, you're never going to stop this thing. Okay, it's just not going to happen. But what that also means is that all these suppression measures that we took were absolutely worthless. They were worth nothing. They did nothing. And furthermore, despite them, we have crazy seroconversion rates among the population, which means this thing's over. And notice, folks, that there was an Israeli researcher or a scientist who noted that regardless of the measure of mitigation taken in a given area, that the virus and the infection rates are all following the same curve. Well, I've noted this too. I started talking about this back when we first started, doing these lockdown things. I said, well, you look at the curve, the R rate at the time that those things were imposed, you could make the argument that there was a reason to be scared. Okay, as a public office holder, you could make that argument. It's not hard to make that at all, actually. However, within a week of having imposed those, the curve had rolled over. Well, within a week was too early for those measures to have actually shown up in the case rates. So that means that within a week, all of these governors and everybody else, they knew they were wrong. Okay, Donald Trump knew he was wrong. Fauci knew he was wrong. Birx knew she was wrong. They all knew they were wrong. Now, they didn't know why they were wrong because they weren't bothering to run antibody testing, but they knew they were wrong. And yet, onward we go, continuing we go. Now you got Trump parading around his 3 phases, which has been signed off on by his wonderful team. And yet you have Cuomo up in New York screaming, oh, you're telling us we have to do all this, but you're not giving us any money. Well, wait a minute. Who was running a huge budget deficit then and on the verge of fiscal collapse? And why were they doing it? Because did you spend all your money on third world invaders? Maybe you did. Maybe you thought that handing out money to people who aren't legal American immigrants or residents or citizens was a good idea. Or maybe you thought that you could just provide services for free without ever collecting any taxes. None of these things make any sense, but this is what all these different governors and states were doing. Same thing with Pritzker in Illinois. Okay, governor of Illinois. You want to talk about somebody that's at high risk for dying of this thing? He'd be on that list. Okay. How about Lightfoot? Okay, in Chicago. Well, no, we don't have to worry about all these things. Oh, all the gangbangers are going to obey social distancing. Yeah, okay. How's that working out for you guys? The reality is that, and then you have Inslee out in Washington who's bleeding that Donald Trump is encouraging insurrection. Really, Mr. Inslee? Well, may I point out that your constitutional authority as governor of a state is always subject to recall and no confidence by the public. And no, the public is not bound to honor your view of, well, you can always go to the voting booth and vote me out in 2 years or 4 years or whatever. No, that's not how it works. Government always exists only with the consent of the governed. If the consent is withdrawn, you really have two options. One is to leave office now, and the second is to leave office now. The only question we're really asking at that point is whether you're doing it on your feet. And that's always been true throughout history. I know that's, you're talking about revolution. Well, actually, yeah. Does anybody know what day tomorrow is? Sunday? What happened on Sunday? Tomorrow. Okay? On the, what is that day? All right, on the 19th. Do you recall? Probably not, because you went to a government school, and therefore you didn't have to worry about such things. Well, maybe you ought to pay attention to what tomorrow is. And then you ought to think about consent and the fact that the lying that has gone on with regards to this virus and the risks that it poses. is just outrageous. I mean, look, folks, the other thing that you have to realize is that the risk of death is, as I pointed out, the New York statistics. And this was just off the people. This was often a reasonable assumption. 50% of the people are asymptomatic. Looks like the number is actually much higher. If you do not have one of a listed set of comorbidities, your risk of dying from this bug is somewhere between 0.03 and 0.06%. Why the wide range? Because when you get into those small numbers, it gets harder to come up with an exact figure, okay? But somewhere between those. Are you still scared? So, look, tell me again why it is that you're hiding under your desk. Right? I mean, are there people for whom this disease poses a significant risk? Yeah, there are. Okay? And then there's another aspect of it, too, which is that we've got now study data showing that perhaps as many as half of the people who had COVID were admitted to the hospital and died didn't actually die of COVID. That they picked up a hospital-acquired infection and they died of bacterial sepsis or something else that wouldn't have happened if they hadn't gone in the hospital. Now, that one gets kind of complicated because if you've got a severe problem with breathing, you need help, right? I mean, this is, sitting and toughing it out at home. But is this, is this something that we ought to call COVID? In other words, if you go into the hospital with a bad bug, okay, and you're getting treated for that, and while you're in there, they give you something else, not COVID, but something else that you get in the hospital, is it appropriate to charge that death off to the bug that you came in the hospital with? Of course not. And yet, what's a percentage of that? All right. And then, of course, we have the statistics I've pointed out for a long time, which is that about half of the people who are dying of this thing are people who are in nursing homes, and yet they represent 0.5% of the population. Well, that's crazy. All right. So there's, but the zero infection control problem within nursing homes has been known for a long time. Nobody cares because, hey, we can scare people. We can destroy the economy. And now the evidence is starting to pile up for what I had been pointing out all the way since the beginning, which is that the evidence is that this bug has been in America, in the United States, for much longer than we had assumed. Did not show up here in February. It's been lurking around for quite a long time. And in addition to that, it just simply isn't anywhere near as deadly as everybody has led us to believe. And the proof is now showing up for this. Never mind the fact that the data showed very clearly before Trump's 15 days, his original 15 days to slow the spread was up, that these mitigations and lockdowns didn't actually do anything. So now the question is what you're going to do about it, America. That's all that's left. Maybe we'll have something tomorrow about what certain people decided to do about it a little over 200 years ago. I'm your Ticker Guy.